It started with a glass of water. Room temperature. No ice, just how she liked it. I'd gotten used to her preferences the way people learn to live near train tracks or under flight paths. It's loud at first, but over time, you stop noticing. The tremble in your chest. You adjust. You shrink. And somehow, you call that compromise. I was standing in our kitchen in Virginia, looking out the window toward the faded fence she kept promising we'd replace together. It was raining lightly, the kind that doesn't fall so much as it hangs in the air, like a thought you can't shake. She was upstairs, taking a bath. Lavender. Always lavender. I could smell it faintly as it drifted down the stairs, mixing with the earthy scent of wet grass and the bitter taste of something I hadn't named yet. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful, just expectant. Like it was holding its breath. I don't know why I opened her laptop. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe intuition. Maybe some part of me already knew. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in my mind, searching for a more innocent reason. But the truth is, I didn't believe her anymore, not fully. And that scared me more than anything else. Her password was still my birthday. That hit harder than it should have. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to feel close to her in some strange, pathetic way. Like maybe reading her search history or watching what videos she'd liked would show me the version of her she never brought into the room with me. The tabs were open. She hadn't even bothered to hide them. A spreadsheet. A long thread of texts in a messaging app I didn't recognize. A shared drive labeled Cycles. None of it made sense at first. It felt like walking into a theater. Halfway through a play, everyone's acting like the stakes are clear, but you're lost. Confused. Out of sync. And then I saw my name. Not once. Dozens of times. I scrolled, heart thudding. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't about another man. It was worse. It was a strategy. A cold, methodical breakdown of who I was, what I feared, how I reacted under pressure. Emotional leverage points. Patterns. The word compliance came up more than once. And next to it, dates, comments, results. I blinked hard. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if it was a game, some sick kind of therapy journal, or personal development. Challenge. But the messages were between her and 2 other women. Friends, maybe? Co-conspirators. Week 7. Tested guilt boundary. Result. 2-day silence. Broke on day 3 with apology plus flowers. Confirmed trigger. Use parental trauma next cycle. Tie to abandonment response. Escalate with withholding. He folds under emotional withdrawal. I didn't know who they were talking about until they used my full name. My goddamn full name. I sat down on the floor, laptop balanced on my knees, fingers trembling. This wasn't love. This wasn't confusion. This was calculated. She said it was love. But everything I was reading said it was control. I couldn't breathe. Not the panicked, gasping for air kind of breathlessness. This was deeper, heavier. Like someone had poured cement into my chest and whispered, "You are never safe here." Every sweet moment, every tearful hug. Every night I sat on the edge of our bed wondering if I was too sensitive, too insecure, too weak for her. It wasn't random. It wasn't chemistry. It was engineering. She had studied me, mapped me, and she was proud of it. And still, I didn't confront her. Not that night. I closed the laptop gently. I poured the water. I walked upstairs, hearing the bathwater still shifting as she moved. And when I opened the door, she smiled. That same soft, sleepy smile that used to undo me. She said, "Took you long enough." And I smiled back. But something in me had broken clean. People like to believe they'd know, that they'd see it coming. That love, no matter how twisted, leaves breadcrumbs. But what they don't understand is that when you're inside it, really inside it, Love and control wear the same skin. I met her 3 years ago at a nonprofit fundraising gala in D.C. I wasn't supposed to be there. My boss at the time had RSVP'd and backed out last minute, and I was the stand-in. She was already on the stage when I arrived, speaking about trauma-informed education for foster youth. She had that voice, the kind that turns a crowded room into a cathedral. Measured, warm. It made you lean in. Afterward, she found me at the bar, told me I looked honestly bored during the speeches, and it made her laugh. I remember that how she laughed like she was trying to give something away. And I took it. Willingly. She was beautiful, sure. But it wasn't that. It was how she made me feel seen without demanding anything in return. At first, I was a consultant back then. Still am working mostly with tech startups, trying to scale without imploding. I was always the calm one in the room. Strategic, measured, that was my thing. But with her, my edges softened. She said she liked how I listened without interrupting, that I made her feel safe. I'd never been with someone who talked about emotional intelligence over dinner like it was foreplay. Who could hold eye contact like she was dissecting you and still make you feel desired? She had a way of making my quiet feel like gravity. We moved in together after 10 months. Too fast, probably. But everything felt like fate. You know that feeling? Like the universe finally hands you the thing it kept from you all those years. You stop questioning. You stop doubting. You call it alignment. You call it love. In the beginning, she was all warmth. Intuitive. Thoughtful. She remembered how I took my coffee, which side of the bed I turned to in my sleep, that I couldn't stand the sound of cutlery scraping ceramic. She never made me explain twice. Never made me feel foolish for my silences. She said she understood the way I hurt, and I believed her. But little by little, I started feeling smaller in the relationship. Like I was always 2 steps behind an unspoken rulebook. She'd say things like, "You're not emotionally available right now, and that's okay." After I opened up about a fight with my brother, I didn't even know how to respond. I just nodded. I thanked her for being patient with me. That's the part one look back on, now and ache for. The version of me that believed I needed fixing. That maybe her insight was love. That my confusion was my own fault. There were times she'd go quiet for days. Not cold exactly, just ... out of reach. And when I asked what was wrong, she'd say, "I just need space. You're reacting out of fear, not reality." She made me believe that my instincts were trauma, that my worry was immaturity, that my heart aching and uncertain wasn't to be trusted. And I let her, because I loved her, because I wanted so badly to be worthy of the kind of love she said she was offering. I see it now, of course. In retrospect, the signs weren't just there, they were screaming. But when you love someone deeply, when you build a home with them, you start calling their red flags complexity. You interpret their silence as depth, their distance as grace. But it was never grace. It was controlled. It was architecture. And it was working. Until that night. Until the lavender bath and the tab she forgot to close. Until the smile that didn't reach her eyes when I handed her the glass and she said, "Took you long enough." She knew. She knew I'd seen it. But she also believed I wouldn't do anything about it. And maybe I wouldn't have. Except the next morning, I woke up before her and checked the trash folder on her laptop. And what I found changed everything. The trash folder held files she never meant to keep, but hadn't yet let go of. A mix of screenshots, voice memos, and something labeled Phase 1, Attachment Curve. I clicked it before I could talk myself out of it. It was a graph. An actual chart mapping my emotional compliance trajectory over the first 12 months of our relationship. She'd plotted incidents, responses, and notes in a clinical, detached tone that made me feel like a subject in an experiment. Month 2. Initial connection. Over-indexes on shared values. High responsiveness. Low resistance. Month 5. Introduced. Mild confusion cycles. Reactivity. Moderate. Guilt index. High. Month 9. Withholding validation effective. Folded within 72 hours. Resume affection pattern. My name was reduced to a line on a curve. Not a man. Not a partner. Just data. And beneath that file, a series of screenshots messages between her and another woman named Jules. I didn't know her, but she seemed to know me intimately. He's emotionally literate, but not confrontational. Perfect subject. I think I can get him to question his sense of reality without even raising my voice. Careful, Jules replied. Don't push too fast. Emotional starvation works better in waves. I know, she wrote back. He's folding exactly on schedule. Folding. That word kept echoing in my chest, like a bruise you find hours after the impact. I didn't cry. Not then. What I felt was older than sadness, older than anger. It was the quiet grief of realizing that someone had studied how to undo you. Then I started remembering things, not memories in the conventional sense, more like emotional stings I'd brushed off. Scattered moments that had lived at the edge of discomfort, never fully unpacked. I remembered the first time I mentioned my mother's anxiety to her, how it shaped me. She'd been so quiet afterward. Too quiet. Later that night, she'd said I reminded her of people who seek validation to feel real. At the time, I thought it was insight. Now, I realize it was a pin stuck in a nerve. I remembered how she used to say, I love how deeply you feel, and then, weeks later, accused me of being emotionally manipulative whenever I cried. How she'd keep a ledger of every mistake I made, but erase her own with silence. I remembered a Sunday afternoon. I'd made us pancakes, trying to shake off a week where she'd barely spoken to me. She took one bite, looked at me, and said, You're trying too hard. I'm not a project. Then she left the table. I apologized. That was always the pattern. I apologized, even when I didn't understand what I'd done, especially then. God. I used to tell myself she was teaching me, that she was helping me grow, that discomfort was part of intimacy, that love was supposed to stretch you. I didn't realize I was being reshaped to fit her design. She made me question my tone, my reactions, even my memory. When I remembered something differently, she'd calmly say, That's not how it happened. Maybe it's time we talk about how your trauma distorts things. And I believed her, because when someone claims to love you and uses the language of healing, you stop trusting your gut. You think you're being nurtured. You think they're wise. But all she was doing was studying how to keep me obedient. It wasn't love. It was leverage. And now, I wasn't just suspicious. I was awake. I closed the laptop. Slowly. Quietly. She was still sleeping in our bed. One hand curled over her stomach, the other resting near my pillow, like she belonged there. The room was warm, but my body felt cold. And that was the first time I realized I hadn't been held in months. Not really. I'd been managed, and I needed to understand how deep the manipulation went, but not with screaming, not with confrontation, with silence, with precision, just like her. Asterisk. That morning, I didn't touch her, not even a kiss on the forehead like I used to out of habit, out of love, out of some long-faded tenderness I kept feeding like a dying fire. I just stood at the doorway, watching the woman who had turned my heart into a blueprint. She looked peaceful, innocent. God, what a performance. She woke up an hour later to the smell of coffee. French press, Ethiopian blend, her favorite. I left it on the knitstand, perfectly measured, steaming, just like always. A detail I knew would reinforce the illusion she needed, that I was still asleep in the palm of her hand. She came downstairs, wearing my old t-shirt, smiling like we were whole. "You're sweet," she said, lifting the mug to her lips. Even after how distant I was last week. I nodded. "It's okay. I figured you needed space." She tilted her head, studying. That's how she always responded to emotional generosity, with suspicion. Because when manipulation is your first language, sincerity looks like a trap. "You're not mad?" she asked, eyes narrowed just slightly. "Not at all," I said. "I get it now." That was my first move. Agreement. Give her what she wants. To hear, reflect calm. No ripples, no alarm bells. Just the same pliable, thoughtful man she believed she'd successfully rewired. Because the more I thought about it, the more I understood. I couldn't just walk away. Couldn't give her the satisfaction of thinking I was some casualty in her emotional war games. Another man broken and discarded, full of confusion and longing. No, I wanted her to see it. Fall apart slowly, silently. I wanted her to feel her grip slipping one quiet inch at a time, and have no idea why. So I studied her. For days, I watched the way she monitored my reactions, the way she used phrases like emotional maturity as a scalpel. I noticed how she played the long game, how moments of sweetness were always followed by withdrawal, like sugar before the leash, and I gave her nothing, not more love, not more protest, just soft, agreeable neutrality. I became the calm sea she could no longer stir. She didn't notice it at first. People like her don't notice silence until it stops echoing back what they want. But cracks started forming. One night, she tried one of her usual tactics, a faint sigh over dinner, the kind meant to signal disappointment without explanation. In the past, I would have leaned in, asked if she was okay, searched her eyes for the thing I did wrong. That night, I said, "Long day?" She blinked. "What?" "You sighed," I said, cutting into my food. Seemed like maybe work was heavy. Today, she watched me for a long second. Yeah, it was. No analysis, no dissection. Just a mirror without interest. She didn't know what to do with it, and I could feel the shift. The second move, unpredictability. I didn't react the way I used to. I didn't reach. I didn't cling. I didn't self-correct. I made her chase the balance she once manipulated. That week, I scheduled lunches she didn't know about. I came home later than usual. I left my phone face down, not because I had anything to hide, but because I wanted to know if she'd asked. She did? "Everything okay?" She asked casually one evening as I dried my hands at the sink. "Yeah," I said. "Why? You've just been different lately." I turned to her and smiled gently. "Different how?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Just quiet. Calm. Almost like you're not worried anymore." And I said, "Maybe I finally learned to trust." It was cruel. But it was also true. Because trust isn't always about belief. Sometimes it's about clarity. I trusted her to be exactly what she'd shown me: strategic, charming, precise, and dangerous. And I was done being the experiment. But I wasn't done watching, because there was still something I didn't understand. Why? Why go through all this effort? Why me? Why us? And that's when I remembered something I'd read in those texts. A single word. Cycles. The shared folder on her drive. It wasn't about me. It was a pattern. A process. And I was just the latest draft. I waited until she left for a client session, some new trauma-informed coaching gig she'd landed with a wellness startup in Arlington. That was her niche. Emotional authority dressed in spiritual self-awareness. People trusted her because she spoke like she'd bled before and healed with grace. But what they didn't see What I now understood too well was how easily that language could be weaponized when used by someone who never stopped taking notes. I logged into the shared Drive Again cycles. The folder was larger than I remembered, dozens of subfolders, each one labeled with a name and a number. John, Cycle 4, Eli. Cycle 5, David, Cycle 7, and me. Michael, Cycle 9. I clicked mine first, needing to see how deep it went. The documents were methodical: observations, behavior logs, interventions, audio files. One of them was a recording. I recognized my voice instantly. It was a fight we had last year. I was upset quietly, so after she canceled our weekend away with no explanation, I'd said, "It just feels like I don't matter in your plans." I remembered the moment. I'd hated how small I sounded. She'd replied, calm and detached, "That sounds like something your mother told you growing up." Not me. The audio had been clipped. My words alone. Labeled, Victim Language Test 3. My stomach turned. Another file. A written assessment of my dependency triggers, including references to my father's death, my work stress cycles, my tone under duress, even the way I apologized when I felt unsafe. But it was the folder labeled Shared Data Cohort that turned my blood cold. Inside were documents, slide decks, breakdowns, templates. One titled Control Napping, Male Emotional Archetypes. Another, Emotional Conditioning Phase Development Model. They were written in professional language, structured like curriculum, used like curriculum, and there were comments. Conversations between at least 5 different contributors. Jules, Lydia, Harper, Sienna, and her. Michael's progressing as expected. Attachment style reactive but trainable. Will update after next shift cycle. Excellent. Let's add this pattern to the 90-day control test. Note: he responds to perceived silence as punishment. Use this in Phase 3 to reinforce dependence. They were testing methods on men who thought they were in love, men who were building futures, sharing secrets, giving themselves unaware that they were case studies in some sick emotional trial, masquerading as healing. It wasn't just her. It was a network, a methodology. Built around behavior modification, dressed up in the language of intimacy. These weren't just manipulative relationships. These were systems of control, dressed as romance. I clicked through more names. Each man had his own folder. Some notes mentioned resistance, others, early collapse. One Eli had a final comment. Subject ceased contact, unexpected blackout. Residual guilt confirmed. No risk. What the hell had they done to him? And why? I closed the drive, heart pounding, the silence of the house pressing in like a weight. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about justice, about reality, about reclaiming mine. But I couldn't just expose her. That would make me look like the bitter ex, the wounded man lashing out. She'd already positioned herself in every social space we shared as the balanced one, the spiritual one. I could already hear her saying it. He just couldn't handle emotional depth. He misread boundaries as betrayal. Men like him collapse under their own shame. No, if I wanted to dismantle this, I'd have to speak her language. Quiet, precise, untraceable. Because if this was a game of control, she needed to feel what it was like to be on the other end of the mirror. And so I began my plan, not for revenge, but for clarity. I didn't confront her with screenshots. I didn't shout. I didn't call her a liar or a predator or a monster, even though the words itched under my tongue like poison. That would have fed the narrative she was ready to twist that I was. Unstable, reactive, emotional. Easy to dismiss. Instead, I began to turn the mirror. It started with small, deliberate withdrawals. I changed the passcode on my phone. Subtle, No explanation. Just a faint shift in privacy. She noticed within a day. New password? She asked, too casually. Yeah, I said, without looking up from my laptop. Work required it. She waited a beat. You've never kept it from me before. I've never had to before. That was all. No defense. No argument. Just enough ambiguity to make her ask herself why. Then I stopped telling her about my day. I let her talk about her clients, her observations, her carefully curated empathy, and I listened the way she once taught me to, with stillness, without affirmation. The first time she noticed, she called it out. You're quieter lately, she said over dinner, watching me. Across the candlelight, like I was a painting that had changed color. I'm just observing, I replied, stabbing a piece of salmon, learning to understand what silence means. Her eyes flickered. Sounds familiar. I thought you'd appreciate it. There was a flicker of unease then, barely perceptible. But I knew her too well not to see it. Control requires feedback. Without it, the entire structure collapses, and so I gave her none. Over the following weeks, I started planting small, destabilizing truths. I left a book open on the table, Gaslighting and the Erosion of Self. I'd underlined a passage. Abuse doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the form of insight. I didn't mention it. 2 days later, I left an envelope in her drawer, unsealed, containing a printed article about psychological coercion. No note, just the words, read me when you're ready. To be honest, she never acknowledged it. But I saw her drawer had been disturbed. Then came the real fracture. I reached out to Eli. I found him through a mutual LinkedIn connection. He was a product designer in Denver now. Quiet online, nothing public about a breakup, no rants. Just a single line in his profile bio. Healing is not linear. I messaged him under a pseudonym at first. Sighed I had questions about a shared acquaintance. He didn't reply for a week. When he did, his response was short. Did she get to you too? And just like that, the final wall cracked. We spoke for 2 hours that night. He told me everything. How she'd left him questioning his sanity. How she'd built him up only to emotionally withdraw whenever he showed vulnerability. How she used shared trauma like currency offering connection in exchange for power. How it took him a year to realize he'd never been loved, only studied. He had the same folders, the same shared drive, the same cycle name. She didn't change. The playbook. She only changed the player. I thanked him, not just for the truth, but for surviving it. And then I knew it was time. I didn't out her publicly. That's not what this was about. Instead, I gathered every file, every message, every voice recording. I compiled a dossier and sent it anonymously to the organization she had just partnered with, the wellness startup, the one that branded her as a relational trauma expert. The email was simple. Before you place your clients in her care, read this. Ask yourself if manipulation dressed as insight is still healing. A week later, she lost the contract. I didn't tell her I had anything to do with it. I didn't gloat. I just watched. She spiraled quietly, stopped meditating, stopped cooking, stayed in bed longer each day. She started asking strange questions, like, do you think people can change who they are? Or are we just pretending? I answered with silence. And then came the night I knew it was all collapsing. We were sitting on the couch, barely speaking. She turned to me and said, I don't know who I am with you anymore. I looked at her, really looked. Her face was drawn, hollowed by the absence of control. And I said softly, maybe that's because you never showed me. Her mouth opened, closed. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to reach for a tool in her arsenal, but I'd taken them all away, and all that was left was the truth. She moved out 2 weeks later. No dramatic goodbye. No final plea. Just a text at 6:17 p.m. while I was at the grocery store. I'm staying with Jules for a while. I think we both need clarity. Clarity. The irony made me smile for the first time in weeks. When I came home, her closet was half empty. Toothbrush gone. Drawers left ajar like she'd fled in haste or hadn't cared enough to close what she opened. That was her way, wasn't it? To begin things intensely and exit with silence. The apartment felt different without her. Not emptier, just quieter. And I didn't realize how much noise she'd brought into my inner world until it was finally still. I stood in the middle of our living room, surrounded by everything we'd once called us. The navy couch we'd picked out together. The lamp she insisted on from that overpriced boutique. The bookshelf we'd filled with titles about healing, insight, attachment. All of it now felt curated for a performance I never auditioned for. And yet, I didn't feel broken. I felt clear. Grief came not all at once, but in waves. It hit when I passed the cafe where she'd once laughed so hard she snorted. When I found a playlist she'd made for my birthday. When I remembered the softness in her voice on nights when I couldn't sleep. And I hated how even the memories were infected now, how every kindness felt counterfeit in hindsight. But I didn't run from it. Let it come. I sat with the ache. I wrote letters I never sent. I started therapy again, real therapy, not the echo chamber she'd turned my inner life into. I spent long mornings walking alone near the Potomac. No headphones, just breath and gravel, and the sound of myself coming back to me. And slowly, I began to reclaim what she had dissected. I stopped apologizing for my empathy, stopped fearing silence. I stopped mistaking manipulation for intimacy, and I started asking myself better questions. Not, why did she do this to me? But, what? Made me ignore what I knew? Not, was it ever real? But why did I need it to be? That was the hardest part, because the truth is, I did want it to be real. Desperately. And maybe that's the lesson. Not that we should never trust, but that we must also trust ourselves. That no matter how convincing the language, how gentle the hands, how sacred the promises, if something feels off, it is. A few months later, I got a message from Eli again. Just one sentence. I heard she's on cycle 10 now. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. And I knew that if I engaged, even from a place of healing, I'd still be circling her orbit. I'm not circling anymore. I'm standing still, grounded, whole. She said it was love. But it was all a game of control. And the moment I stopped playing, I finally won something real. Myself. Asterisk. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Click the video on the screen and I'll see you there.